June 2022. The initial shock of the full-scale invasion had passed, but the war had not ended. It had transformed. After failing to seize Kiev, Russia's war machine recalibrated, turning its immense weight eastward. The new objective was the complete capture of the Donbas, Ukraine's industrial heartland, a region scarred by conflicts since 2014. The war's center of gravity shifted into the factories, suburbs, and river valleys of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. Here, two cities, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, stood astride the Seversky River, forming the next decisive line of battle. They were the last major urban centers in Luhansk Oblast under Ukrainian control, and for Moscow, their capture was a critical political and military goal. For Kyiv, holding them was a symbol of unbreakable resistance. As the strategic lens focused, maps narrowed to the east. The twin cities became the epicenter of the conflict. Severodonetsk, a sprawling industrial city, sat on the flat exposed south bank of the river. Across the water, its sister city, Lysychansk, occupied the commanding high ground. This geography dictated the brutal logic of the battle to come. From the hills of Lysychansk, Ukrainian artillery could dominate the approaches to Severodonetsk, but this advantage was contingent on holding the city itself. The river, a natural defensive barrier, was now the final bulwark. These two linked cities, connected by bridges that were already being targeted, were bracing for a storm of steel. In Severodonetsk, the storm broke with relentless fury. The fighting devolved into a brutal, close-quarters grind. It was a battle fought not for kilometers, but for meters. Street by street, block by block, the city was consumed. The fighting ground on in the rubble of what were once homes and lives. Stairwells became vertical battlefields. Courtyards turned into kill zones, and shattered apartments offered fleeting, treacherous cover. Positions were traded by the hour, sometimes by the minute, under a ceaseless deluge of Russian artillery. For the Ukrainian defenders, it was a desperate, heroic stand against overwhelming firepower, a battle of attrition designed to bleed them dry. Looming over the apocalyptic landscape of the fight was the Azot chemical plant. Much like the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, this vast industrial complex became a fortress within the city. Its sprawling network of underground bunkers and reinforced structures provided a final bastion for the defenders. But it was also a sanctuary of last resort for hundreds of civilians, trapped by the fighting. The plant's towering smokestacks, stark against the sky, became grim landmarks, framed by the constant strobing flashes of artillery in the night. The presence of civilians and hazardous materials added a terrifying dimension to the battle, a constant threat of a man-made catastrophe layered upon the horrors of war. The fluid, chaotic nature of urban warfare meant that traditional front lines ceased to exist. Command posts shifted constantly, often located in damp basements just meters from enemy positions. Communication was a lifeline, but one that was frequently severed. Small, agile teams of Ukrainian soldiers maneuvered through a maze of alleys choked with debris, past the skeletal remains of burned-out vehicles and the collapsing facades of apartment blocks. Every window was a potential sniper's nest, every doorway a possible ambush. Survival depended on speed, stealth, and an intimate knowledge of the city's broken anatomy. By late June, the strategic calculus hardened. The defense of Severodonetsk had achieved its primary purpose, to inflict maximum casualties on the advancing Russian forces and buy precious time for Ukraine to absorb Western weapons and prepare new defensive lines. But the cost was immense. Positions were being held at a staggering price in lives and materiel. Ammunition for Ukrainian artillery, though used skillfully, was critically strained against Russia's seemingly infinite stockpiles. Evacuations of the wounded became harrowing operations, conducted under direct fire, with medics risking everything to pull their comrades from the line. The city was becoming a tomb. The decision was made. To avoid a catastrophic encirclement and preserve its veteran soldiers for future battles, the Ukrainian command ordered a strategic withdrawal. On June 25th, the final units began to pull back across the Severodonetsk With the main bridges already destroyed, the retreat was a perilous feat of engineering and courage. Engineers worked under fire to establish pontoon crossings, while other units slipped through smoke screens to the relative safety of the northern bank. As they left, they blew the remaining bridge spans, denying them to the enemy and completing the isolation of the ruined city. Severodonetsk had fallen, but its defenders had not been broken. The fight immediately rolled across the river to Lysychansk. There was no respite. The city's position on a dominant ridgeline, which had once provided Ukrainian gunners with excellent fields of fire onto Severodonetsk, now made it a prime target. Russian forces, now controlling the opposite bank, unleashed the full might of their artillery. The streets of Lysychansk, which had echoed with the sound of outgoing fire for weeks, were now hammered day and night by an incoming storm. The tactical advantage had shifted, and the defenders braced for a direct assault. The air and land trembled with the violence of the assault. Intense counter-battery duels cracked across the valleys as Ukrainian guns tried to silence the Russian batteries pounding the city, but they were outgunned. Russian Su-25 attack aircraft, the heavily armored flying tanks, screamed in on low-level attack runs, unleashing salvos of rockets that tore into defensive positions. These airstrikes were followed by the indiscriminate terror of Grad multiple launch rocket systems, a signature of the Russian way of war. These salvos, representative of the overwhelming tempo of the assault, were designed not just to destroy but to demoralize, pressing defenders deeper into cover and shattering the city's infrastructure. The city's industrial heart was systematically targeted. The Lysychansk oil refinery, one of the largest in Ukraine, burned for days, sending a thick black plume of smoke into the sky that was visible for kilometers. Warehouses, railheads, and any structure that could support the city's defense were relentlessly pounded. Craters multiplied around these key logistic nodes, severing the arteries that fed the front line with ammunition, food, and reinforcements. The strategy was clear: to isolate, starve, and pulverize the city into submission. By July 2nd, with Russian units advancing from the south and breaching the city's edge, the threat of encirclement became undeniable. Another bloody last stand in a shattered city was not an option. On July 3rd, in a painful but necessary decision, Ukrainian forces conducted another organized withdrawal, pulling back to new defensive lines to the west. They retreated in good order, preserving precious combat power for the battles yet to come. Moscow immediately claimed the capture of Lysychansk and with it all of Luhansk Oblast. It was a significant territorial gain, but the immense cost in men and equipment and the time it had taken to achieve made it a hollow Pyrrhic victory. The front line, now reshaped, pivoted west toward the town of Siversk. Here, the terrain, combined with exhausted Russian formations and stiffening Ukrainian resistance, caused the advance to slow to a crawl. The grinding momentum of the Donbas offensive was beginning to wane. Simultaneously, the focus of Russian efforts began to shift south toward the city of Bakhmut. Along this new axis, a new, even more brutal battlefront began to take shape, one that would come to define the war for many months. As the summer progressed, a new factor began to alter the battlefield's geometry. Western artillery, promised for months, began arriving in meaningful numbers. The American-made M777 howitzer, with its longer range and precision-guided munitions, allowed Ukrainian gunners to strike with an accuracy that had been impossible before. For the first time, they could effectively engage in counter-battery fire, hunting and destroying the Russian guns that had terrorized their cities. Sophisticated counter-battery radars supplied by allies could pinpoint the origin of incoming shells, allowing for a rapid and deadly response. The Russian artillery's reign of uncontested dominance was beginning to end. Then came the game-changer, HIMARS, the M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system. With a range exceeding 80 kilometers and pinpoint GPS guidance, HIMARS gave Ukraine the ability to reach deep into the Russian rear. The primary targets were not front-line trenches, but the enemy's nervous system, ammunition depots, fuel dumps, bridges, and headquarters. Suddenly, no command post was safe. Night after night, Ukrainian strikes began to find their marks. Massive secondary explosions would light up the horizon as entire ammunition depots cooked off, a testament to the weapon's effectiveness. The strikes bent Russia's logistics arc, forcing them to move their supply hubs further from the front, complicating their operations and starving their artillery of shells. Beyond the trenches and artillery duels, a parallel war was being waged on the economic front. The international coalition supporting Ukraine tightened its grip. Unprecedented sanctions sought to cripple Russia's war economy. Key Russian banks were cut off from the SWIFT international payment system, hampering financial transactions. Embargoes on technology exports aimed to degrade Russia's military-industrial complex over the long term. At home, the Russian population began to feel the effects as inflation surged and Western companies departed. Yet the Kremlin's war chest, buoyed by soaring energy prices, proved resilient. Russia skillfully redirected its oil and gas flows to new markets in Asia, mitigating the immediate impact of Western sanctions. While Russia's economy weathered the storm, Ukraine's was on life support. The physical destruction was immense. Constant missile strikes targeted infrastructure nationwide, while the Russian naval blockade of the Black Sea choked off Ukraine's primary export routes. Ports idled, their cranes standing like silent sentinels. Factories deprived of power, raw materials, and workers ran on fumes or shut down entirely. The country's GDP plummeted. It was international financial and humanitarian aid that filled the cavernous gaps, keeping the state functioning and providing a lifeline to millions of displaced and affected citizens. In this economic struggle, Ukraine's vast grain harvest became a geopolitical weapon. With millions of tons trapped in silos, global food prices soared, threatening famine in vulnerable nations across the Middle East and Africa. Russia was accused of weaponizing hunger. After intense negotiations brokered by Turkey and the United Nations, a fragile deal was struck. On July 22nd, an agreement was signed to create a safe corridor for guarded grain convoys from the port of Odessa. The world breathed a cautious sigh of relief. But less than 24 hours later, on July 23rd, Russian Kalibr cruise missiles struck the port's infrastructure. While not hitting the grain terminals directly, the message was unambiguous. A warning shot not just at Ukraine, but at a starving world, demonstrating that the deal existed only at Moscow's pleasure. Despite the missile threat, Russia's naval dominance in the northwestern Black Sea had been checked. The stunning sinking of the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, the cruiser Moskva-VAH, by Ukrainian Neptune missiles in April had been a profound shock to the Russian Navy. The loss forced the fleet to operate much farther offshore, outside the range of Ukraine's anti-ship capabilities. This created a vital buffer. The threat of an amphibious assault on Odessa, a major fear in the war's early weeks, had now significantly receded. The city breathed a little easier, its coastal defenses standing vigilant. Yet the horizon still carried missiles, a constant reminder that no part of Ukraine was truly safe. While the world's attention was fixed on the Donbas, Ukraine was quietly setting the stage for its next major move. In the south, in the occupied territories west of the Dnipro River, a systematic campaign of shaping operations was underway. Using the new long-range artillery, particularly HIMARS, Ukrainian forces began to dismantle Russia's military infrastructure in the Kherson region. Night after night, ammo depots cracked open in spectacular fireballs. Command posts were hit, forcing them to shift constantly and disrupting communications. Critical radar sites and air defense systems went dark, blinding the occupiers and making them vulnerable. This was not a full-scale offensive yet, but a methodical degradation of the enemy's ability to fight. The centerpiece of this southern campaign was the Antonivsky Bridge near Kherson. This bridge, along with a smaller one at Nova Kakhovka, was the primary artery supplying the tens of thousands of Russian troops on the west bank of the Dnipro. It came under repeated, precise fire. The strikes were not aimed at dropping the bridge entirely, but at rendering it unusable for heavy military traffic. Each rocket impact was a carefully placed blow, severing another crucial supply line across the wide expanse of the river. By late July, the strategy was bearing fruit. The bridge spans were pockmarked with holes, making them nearly impassable for tanks, artillery, and heavy supply trucks. Russian logistics were thrown into chaos. Convoys were forced to reroute to makeshift ferries and vulnerable pontoon crossings, all operating under the constant threat of Ukrainian fire. The Russian grouping in Kherson was being slowly, deliberately isolated, their backs to the river. The trap was being set. To the north, around Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv, another success story was unfolding. After weathering a brutal siege in the war's opening months, Ukrainian troops had launched a series of successful counteroffensives. They methodically pushed the occupiers back from the city's outskirts, liberating surrounding villages one by one. The signs of returning life followed in their wake. Ukrainian flags were hoisted once more, and some civilians began to return to their damaged homes. Crucially, the advance pushed Russian artillery beyond the range of the city center. The daily indiscriminate shelling that had terrorized Kharkiv's residents for months finally receded, bringing a fragile, hard-won peace to the city streets. Elsewhere, the front lines had settled into a grim, attritional pattern. In the vast open fields of Zaporizhia Oblast, along the Orikhiv-Hulyai-Potlay sector, neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The fighting congealed into a bloody, repetitive rhythm. A small-scale advance to seize a tree line or a village, followed by a massive retaliatory bombardment, forcing a withdrawal. It was the brutal rhythm of a summer stalemate, a war of attrition fought under a scorching sun, where ground was measured in meters and paid for in blood. But all along the Eastern Front, the sound of the war was growing louder around one place in particular, Bakhmut. As the summer wore on, the city was transforming from a secondary objective into the main focus of Russia's offensive effort. The signs were unmistakable. The roads leading into the city were increasingly cratered and treacherous. The tree lines that offered cover to defenders were splintered and shredded by shrapnel. Warehouses and industrial buildings on the outskirts were gutted by shell fire as the axis of the Russian advance pulled more and more guns into range. The meat grinder was being assembled. And yet, beneath the thunder of the guns, the pulse of Ukrainian life continued, defiant and unbroken. In frontline cities, civilians queued for water from tankers, a daily ritual of survival. In the damp quiet of basements and bomb shelters, children escaped into the worlds of books and screens, their childhoods unfolding in the shadow of war. And everywhere there were the volunteers, the lifeblood of the nation's resilience, carrying boxes of food and medicine up shattered stairwells to those who couldn't leave. The state, though under immense strain, refused to collapse. The iconic blue and yellow trains of Ukrainian railways continued to run, a symbol of national connectivity and defiance. Clinics and hospitals, damaged or destroyed, reopened in schoolrooms and subway stations. Teachers, themselves often displaced, taught classes online from crowded shelters, determined to give their students a future. It was ordinary courage, displayed on an extraordinary scale, everywhere. By midsummer, the front stretched for roughly 1,200 kilometers, a vast, jagged scar across the face of the country. From the forests north of Kharkiv to the Black Sea coast near Kherson, trenches cut through the rich black earth. Artillery batteries, hidden in copses and ravines, traded fire day and night. Along this line, countless villages and towns, caught in the crossfire, changed hands, were destroyed and vanished under a shroud of dust and smoke. After the fluid battles of the spring, both armies now dug in for a long war. Soldiers on both sides labored to improve their positions, building elaborate revetments to protect their armor, filling tens of thousands of sandbags, and constructing deep bunkers to withstand artillery. They were preparing not just for the next attack, but for the coming autumn rains and the bitter winter, bracing against the elements as much as the enemy. By the end of July, the map told a story of brutal conquest and stubborn defiance. Russia held the entirety of Luhansk Oblast, most of Kherson, and significant parts of Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia. But these gains had come at a ruinous cost, and their advance had largely stalled. Ukraine, though it had lost territory, held the one thing that mattered most: the state itself. It held the unbreakable will of its people, and it now possessed a growing arsenal of advanced weapons from its allies, with more arriving every day. Far from the front, in Poland and Romania, a massive logistical effort was in full swing. Pallets of ammunition, shells, and missiles crossed the border into Ukraine around the clock. Logistics hubs, managed by Ukrainian and allied personnel, thrummed with activity. The flags of dozens of partner nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, Germany, Canada, and many others, lined the crates, a visible symbol of a global coalition determined to prevent Ukraine's defeat. In Kyiv, a city now free from direct assault, a sense of normalcy had returned, but it was a normalcy layered over a deep awareness of the ongoing war. Church bells tolled at sunset over a skyline unscarred by recent battle. But in fields and training grounds beyond the capital and across the country, the nation was preparing for the future. Recruits, drawn from all walks of life, were being forged into soldiers, forming new brigades, and learning the hard lessons paid for in blood during the war's first 6 months. Endurance, not triumph, defined the summer of 2022. It was a season of brutal losses and tactical retreats, but also of heroic stands and the quiet accumulation of strength. It was a test of will, a measure of resolve against overwhelming force. And in the calculus of a long war, endurance is the foundation of victory. Among the fields of sunflowers, the national flower of Ukraine, now a global symbol of resistance, the wreckage of war lay rusting. Beside the burned hulks of tanks and armored vehicles, the land waited, scarred, stubborn, and profoundly, resiliently alive. Title card.